Chapter 18. The Taxi Driver Who Knew. It is ironic how the briefest encounters in a city like Istanbul can leave the deepest impressions. The taxi driver who knew was one such fleeting figure in my life. His kindness, though small, cut through the suffocating darkness of my nightly routines, reminding me that not everyone in this city wore the same predatory mask. I remember the night vividly. I had just left a grueling party in a rundown apartment. The men had been drunk, boorish, and I escaped earlier than usual, claiming I felt sick. My nerves were frayed, my body aching. Huddled on a curb at 2 a.m., I waved down a taxi. The driver pulled up, a middle-aged man with streaks of gray in his hair and weary eyes that suggested he had been driving these streets for years. I slid into the back seat, murmuring my address. The stench of stale cologne from that apartment clung to my clothes, but the taxi smelled faintly of citrus. As we drove, I gazed out the window, shoulders tense. My mind replayed the night's humiliations, the men's cruel jokes, the bruises they left. Usually, taxi drivers either ignored me or made small talk. This one was silent at first, though not unkindly so. We approached a traffic light, and he glanced at me through the rearview mirror. "Late night, Kizim?" he asked softly in Turkish, using that gentle term for daughter or girl. I gave a curt nod, not wanting to talk, but his voice carried a warmth I had not heard in a while. He continued in halting Russian once he realized my accent. "You from Ukraine?" A pang shot through me. I hesitated, then admitted, "Yes." Typically I avoided revealing my background, but something in his tone felt safe. He sighed, turning the wheel carefully. "I have daughters near your age. Hard to see you out alone so late." His eyes returned to the mirror, concern etched in them. My chest tightened. Usually, older men scolded or leered, but he looked genuinely worried, like a father might. I swallowed a knot in my throat, forcing a neutral expression. For a moment we rode in silence. Then he reached over to adjust the air conditioning, glancing back at me. "You want it warmer or cooler?" I realized I was shivering, though not from cold. "Warmer, please," I whispered. He nodded, cranking up the heat. A subtle kindness. He did not press me with more questions. Instead, he turned on the radio, a soft melody filling the car. Outside, Istanbul's neon signs whirled by. My mind reeled with the usual anxieties. What if this driver had shady intentions? But his demeanor radiated paternal care rather than menace. When we neared my neighborhood, I squirmed, anticipating the man might notice the seedy building or sense the tension. My mother's boyfriend was likely inside, half drunk, waiting to demand my earnings. We slowed to a stop. I rummaged for money in my purse. He glanced back, catching the bruise on my wrist. His eyes flickered with sympathy, though he said nothing. Instead, he quietly muttered the fare. I extended a few bills, prepared for the standard transaction, but he shook his head, returning half of it. "Keep," he murmured in broken Russian. "You need more than me." My heart lurched, tears threatening. Nobody in this city had ever shown me such unsolicited compassion. I forced a shaky smile, voice trembling. "Spasibo," I whispered. He gave a small nod, his eyes reflecting a fatherly sadness. Then he pulled away, leaving me on the curb, clutching the returned bills like a lifeline. I stood there, stunned. The clang of a distant metal gate jolted me back to reality. Usually, taxi drivers might overcharge or pester me for personal details. This one did the opposite, giving me money back. My chest felt tight, tears burning behind my eyes. In that moment, the rotting facade of the building, the stench of garbage, everything else receded. I stepped inside feeling not worthless, but seen, if only for a fleeting instant. My mother was asleep, so I tiptoed to my room, replaying the driver's voice. "You need more than me." That night, I sobbed softly into my pillow, not from despair, but from the overwhelming confusion of someone showing me kindness I had not earned or even asked for. A couple of weeks later, I found myself in Taksim at an ungodly hour once again, needing a ride home. The streets were buzzing with weekend partiers. I flagged a taxi without looking at the driver's face, too exhausted to care. When I slid in and mumbled my address, a soft intake of breath made me glance up. It was him, the same older driver. recognition flickered in his eyes. He offered a gentle smile, wordlessly shifting into gear. I felt a rush of relief, like reuniting with a friend. We rode in silence for a while, the hum of the engine and the distant throb of Taksim's clubs filling the gap. Eventually, he asked in Turkish if I was okay. My throat tightened, tears prickling. "I'm fine," I lied. He exhaled quietly, glancing at me in the mirror. "You don't look fine, Kazim." I bit my lip, uncertain how to respond. Who was I to him? Just a passenger, yet his concern felt genuine. Before I knew it, words tumbled out, halting confessions about how tired I was, how draining it felt to juggle endless nights of forced smiles. I did not detail everything. I left out the bleakest truths. But I hinted at living with an abusive man, at my mother's reliance on me, at feeling trapped in a city of predators. He listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding. When we stopped at a red light, he turned slightly, meeting my eyes. "Too young for so much sorrow," he murmured. I swallowed, tears threatening to spill. He did not offer solutions or judge me. He just drove, letting me vent until we reached my street. This time I insisted on paying the full fare. He accepted it silently, pressing a small chocolate bar into my hand instead. "Eat," he said. "You're too thin." I stared at the chocolate, blinking back tears. Another paternal gesture, intangible but so healing. He gave a final nod, then drove off, leaving me near my building with a bittersweet ache in my chest. That night, I told my mother about the taxi driver in quiet, halting phrases. She listened, eyes wide. "He gave you back money? And a chocolate bar?" she asked, voice trembling. I nodded, tears in my eyes. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears slipping. "Bless him," she whispered. "I wish we met more people like that." We hugged, both overwhelmed that in a city where men often took advantage, one had shown fatherly kindness with no strings attached. In the following weeks, I occasionally lingered near Taksim, half hoping to see his taxi again. My mother teased me about having a city angel. I shrugged, feeling sheepish. Maybe I wanted more fatherly reassurance from him. Maybe it was naive to cling to that ephemeral connection. Once I glimpsed a similar taxi, rushed forward, only to find a different driver. Disappointed, I realized how silly I was being. He was a random man with a good heart, not my personal savior. But the memory of his compassion kept me afloat during my darkest nights. Fate handed me one last ride with him. Late at night, after a client's rough treatment that left me trembling, I flagged a taxi near an alley. The driver slowed, headlights illuminating my worn face. I slid into the back seat half in a daze and recognized him instantly. He gave me a long, appraising look in the rearview mirror. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly in Turkish, noticing bruises on my arm. I forced a weak smile, shaking my head. "It's nothing serious." This time, he turned off the radio, the hush in the cab wrapping around us. As we drove, the city's neon glinted on the windows, painting flickers of color across my battered arms. I felt safe in his presence, tears threatening again. Halfway home, he pulled the car to a quiet curb. My breath caught, fear spiked, recalling how men sometimes lured me. But his eyes were kind, sorrowful. "I'm sorry," he said, switching to a mix of broken Russian and Turkish. "I cannot do anything big, but I can listen. If you need to cry, cry." It was as if he unlocked a dam. I sobbed, arms crossed over my chest. My father had never been around to see me grow up, so this man's paternal approach shattered my defenses. He offered me a box of tissues from the glove compartment, letting me weep in the back seat. Through choked breath, I thanked him for being kind when no one else was. He nodded, eyes rimmed with empathy. "I see many girls like you. This city can be cruel," he murmured. "I have 2 daughters. They are away, but I think of them when I see you." We resumed driving. He spoke gently, cautioning me to be careful, to avoid certain districts after midnight if I could. He recommended a women's shelter he had heard about, though I doubted it would help my specific situation. Still, his concern was genuine, without a hint of exploitation. When we reached my apartment, he insisted the ride was free. I tried to pay, but he waved his hand. "No. Keep your money." Then he glanced at the bruise on my arm. rage flickering in his eyes. "You deserve better," I slid out, tears clinging to my lashes. Before driving off, he pressed a small slip of paper into my hand, his personal phone number. "If you're in danger," he said quietly, "call me. I will come if I can." I stood on the curb, clutching that paper. He drove away, taillights fading into the night. I realized I did not even know his name. To me, he was simply the taxi driver who knew how broken I felt, how precarious my life was, yet chose not to judge. When I showed my mother the slip of paper, tears glistened in her eyes. She held it reverently, as though it were a holy relic. "Maybe he's an angel," she joked, half laughing through tears. "Or maybe just a good man in a bad city." We pinned the number to my wall, uncertain if I would ever use it. The man at home must not see it, or he would grow suspicious. So we concealed it behind an old photo. Sometimes in my darkest hours I would glance at it, remembering the gentle fatherly presence. Life resumed its harsh cycle. I never actually dialed that number, afraid of dragging him into my mess. But knowing I had it gave me a strange solace. In a place where men constantly demanded or hurt me, one had shown unconditional empathy. Zara teased me about my knight in shining taxi, but she also recognized its significance. "Men like that are rare here," she said, exhaling smoke. "Treasure the memory, even if you never see him again." She was right. I clung to it as proof not all men had that hollow, predatory gaze. Once or twice I thought I spotted his taxi passing near Aksaray, but I could not be sure. My heart pounded, wanting to wave him down, but the traffic was too dense. Part of me wished for one more chance to say thank you, or to confide the final horrors I'd endured. But maybe it was better this way. He remained a bright cameo in my bleak narrative. Sometimes, at night, I would see my mother gently pressing her lips to the slip of paper he gave me, like she was bestowing a blessing. She would whisper, "Ya Rab, protect him for helping my daughter." That small ritual brought her comfort. She rarely prayed in front of me, but this man's kindness bridged her battered faith. Of course, I had moments of skepticism. Could he truly help me if I faced real danger? The city's networks of abusers ran deep. But I realized the point was not to rely on him for rescue. His gift was simpler, reminding me that empathy existed, that not all grown men saw me as currency. In a world that daily reinforced the opposite, that reminder was priceless. Months trickled by. My mother and I kept planning our escape, forging contacts for fake passports, stashing money. The city's routine continued. I would meet men, endure meaningless kisses, sometimes flee clubs at dawn. Yet whenever a taxi emerged from the swirl of headlights, I would peer inside, half hoping to glimpse that gentle gaze again. Usually, it was a stranger. Eventually, I accepted that those 3 rides were all I would get. I moved on, focusing on survival, battered by each new ordeal. But in my darkest nights, I would recall the driver's quiet voice asking, "Are you hurt?" I would remind myself that someone once cared enough to ask. Though trivial in the grand scheme, the taxi driver who knew remained a beacon for me. He never demanded my number, never pressed for personal details. He offered fatherly warmth, an anomaly in a city that typically devoured girls like me. Sometimes I fantasized about calling him from a bus station if my mother and I finally fled. Maybe he would drive us to the border, wish us luck, watch us vanish into a dawn that did not reek of last night's illusions. But that was just a fantasy. We had to secure passports and a plan that did not endanger him. Above all, he taught me that not all gestures are transactions. In a place where kisses, touches, even smiles had a price, his compassion was free. He owed me nothing, yet gave me respite and hope. That distinction was jarring. The city hammered into me the concept that everything must be paid for, especially kindness. But this man bucked that rule. He knew my pain without turning it into currency. I realized that if I ever escaped, I would strive to replicate that kindness for someone else. Maybe that was the deeper lesson. Empathy could exist even in the darkest corners, if we let it. The slip of paper with his number eventually wore at the edges. My mother and I decided to hide it in an envelope with other important documents. We never called, but it stayed in our possession, a testament to the night that fatherly concern overshadowed the city's cruelty. the taxi driver who knew wasn't my savior. He was just a man who recognized my humanity for a few brief rides. Yet that recognition burned into my memory with more force than any single client or abuser. If my mother and I ever broke free of Istanbul's clutches, part of my gratitude would go to him, some random father figure who saw a broken girl and offered gentleness in a world that thrived on harshness. That was enough. Enough to keep me from drowning. Enough to prove that not every ride in this city ended in heartbreak. When I recall him, I think of his quiet voice saying, "Keep your money, you need it more," and the warmth that bloomed in my chest, a stark contrast to my usual numbness. In a city where I had learned to expect the worst from men, his small, persistent kindness became a lifeline. Even if only in memory, the taxi driver who knew gave me a reason to believe that genuine compassion could still flourish among the shadows. And in Istanbul, that was the rarest treasure of all.